So one thing that I suspect that we'll see is unemployment going up and employment of humans going down. We build machines because it is better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans. For instance, we build telescopes because they can see better than us. We build tractors because they're stronger than us. We build cars because they're faster than us. We do all of these different things because it makes up for some deficit that humans have. And so we build a machine or a tool or a technology that has superhuman abilities. And that's what we're doing with AI. We're building machines that have superhuman intelligence, superhuman thinking. Now, one thing that concerns me, though, is if machines are better than humans in all ways, which they soon could be, then there's no reason for the new jobs that are created to go to humans because we're going to be slow and expensive.
Hello and welcome to Polyweb. I'm your host, Sara Landi Tortoli, and my guest today is David Shapiro, content creator, AI researcher, and writer. In his YouTube channel and in the AI community, David is famous not only for covering the latest breakthrough in the AI development, but also for providing frameworks and thinking systems around concepts such as AGI and what does it mean for our day-to-day life. In fact, in this conversation, we cover all of these and a lot more, including things such as post-labor economics, but also which type of jobs are going to be AGI-resistant and what type of jobs instead are going to be replaced. And it's one of the most interesting conversations I've ever recorded in this podcast. So I really hope that you will enjoy it as much as I did. David, welcome to Polyweb.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I was mentioning to you before we started that it's very surreal for me to have you here on the podcast because I basically watched all of your videos on YouTube. So thank you very much, really, for joining. I have so many questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into it.
I thought that a good place to start this conversation, because I think it sets the stage for understanding all that is coming and also for our discussion, is the concept of post-nihilism. So maybe for listeners, can you explain what it is and why is it relevant at this particular moment in time?
Yeah, absolutely. So post-nihilism, I didn't coin the term, but it's something that I've been working on. And for some background, we've been on the rise of secularism for quite a long time. I'm probably more so in Europe. I think that Europe is far more secular than America is, but secularism is on the rise here as well. And so there's many commentators around the world. Some of the biggest names are ones like Jordan Peterson, who talk about how the rise of secularism and the rise of nihilism has caused, moral decays and crisis in society. And then some of my other contemporaries, namely John Vervaeke, talks about what he calls the meaning crisis. And essentially, we are going through a transition period. It's a philosophical transition period, an intellectual and spiritual transition period globally. And I personally call it what I call the nihilistic crisis, and I'll unpack kind of that model in a minute. But basically, as I was reading about society and mental health and intergenerational trauma and all kinds of other things, you see my bookcase behind me is completely full. The entire top shelf is like mental health and relationships and family. And so what emerged to me after reading several dozen books on the state of mental health today is I realized that nihilism is kind of the underpinning problem. And so then I said, okay, well, if nihilism is the problem, we need to move beyond this. We need something, we need to enter into a new spiritual and philosophical paradigm. And that's what I called post-nihilism. Although some people have said that they've characterized what I say as more like anti-nihilism. But I call it post-nihilism because it's time we're ready to move beyond this nihilistic outlook. And so what do I mean by a nihilistic outlook? So nihilism is the assertion or belief that there is no meaning in the world, and so therefore there's no grounding, there's no epistemic grounding, there's no moral grounding. It's just we live in a cold, indifferent, uncaring universe, and we are little more than ants on a ball of rock. And of course, that's a very bleak outlook, but that is a very compelling worldview, especially if in the absence of more traditional old-fashioned religions. You say, okay, well, if you throw that out, what's left? And you say, well, maybe nothing is left. And while most people are not explicitly nihilists, once you understand the pattern, and I'll talk about again the nihilistic crisis, it's a framework that I've developed. Once you recognize that pattern, you actually see that nihilism is woven into our society. And so the nihilistic crisis, it is a framework that I came up with, and it's basically four pillars, four kinds of expressions of nihilism, and I call it the four abandonments. And so the first is childhood abandonment. And in America and other English speaking nations, we called it latchkey kids. I don't know what you might call it in Germany, but basically these were children that were kind of left to their own devices. This started happening particularly when you had dual income homes and children would get home, let themselves in, feed themselves, and had very little interaction with their parents on a regular basis. And this trend has continued. And so this is the first phase of the nihilistic crisis. And what this does is it teaches children that they're going to basically be on their own. And this is kind of a new phenomenon that is due in part due to technological and economic and social progress. And this is what people like Jordan Peterson rail against. They say, women need to get back in the home and raise children, and we need to have traditional family structures, which they are right in some respects, that these changes, these sociological changes in society have contributed to a sense of loneliness and isolation and abandonment. But when you understand the impact that this has, it's not just a matter of, because yes, many children learn to adapt, learn to cope, they're safe enough, they're well taken care of, but we have evolved to really need a community. They say it takes a village to raise a child, but now we have children raising themselves. And so what this does is it sets society up for the second abandonment, which is social abandonment. Social abandonment is you have an entire generation or several generations of children that were kind of left to their own devices, and so they're accustomed to loneliness. They're accustomed to being self-reliant, and this then is reflected in social trends, political trends, and economic trends, and then it gets passed on from one generation to the next. And this is why it's no surprise to me the Generation Z, the people that are what I think 25 and under, they're the loneliest, most depressed, and most anxious generation ever. They're even worse off than we millennials were, and they're even worse. And of course, we millennials are worse off than Gen X was. And so this is what is part of the vicious cycle of nihilism, where it's people get lonelier and lonelier and more abandoned, and you end up with people kind of in the sort of Stockholm syndrome where they believe that rugged individualism is the answer, and so that they even double down. It's comfort in the devil that you know. And so all of this is combined with kind of the original nihilism, which is what I call cosmic abandonment, which is you look up into the universe, we are utterly alone in the cosmos as far as we can tell. We have telescopes that can see billions and billions of light years, and yet we see no other sign of life, no other sign of gods. And so, it's just us on this little ball of rock. And that's really kind of cosmically terrifying. And then finally, with social abandonment and childhood abandonment and cosmic abandonment, you end up with self abandonment, where people basically just kind of give up. And sometimes you have people double down on being workaholics. That's kind of what I'm a recovering workaholic, where it's like, well, there's not really anything out there. So let me just make more money and try and get by. You have people turning to video games and porn, particularly young men. You have people turning to drugs. This is why you also see things like suicide rates going up, and particularly in segments of the population that feel more left behind. You'll have what's called deaths from despair. So that's from alcoholism, drug overdoses, and suicide, those sorts of things. And the rise of these is what I point to as evidence of this vicious cycle of nihilism. And so post nihilism is basically saying we are ready for something else. And so post nihilism, kind of the mantra is it's an active and energetic rejection of nihilism. We need something else. We need to find other patterns of society. We need to find other patterns of philosophy and morality that really kind of remain more humanistic and say, hey, we have evolved to have certain needs, whether they're social needs or emotional needs and those sorts of things, and we can actually take a scientific approach to construct a new worldview, which I'm happy to get into, but I'm going to pause there because that was a long spiel. Where do you want to go from there?
I love the analysis so far. I think there are so many nuances to that, and also what led us here in the first place. And I agree that we need something else, especially, I mean, we're going to talk about it, the concept of AGI and post-labor economics, and it will become increasingly clear why post-nihilism is so important in such type of society. But honestly, since we were orphaned by religion, nothing has been able to replace that void. And I feel that perhaps in Europe we have this even more than in the States. Because in the States, religion somewhat is still very strong. In
Mhm.
Europe, even though we have like the Vatican, the Catholic Church, like the majority of people here don't believe, especially like millennials, Gen Z,
Mhm.
churches here are empty, basically.
Mm.
And therefore, what can be as powerful as religions to go back to the sense of meaning and belonging? And meaning and belonging, I agree with you, also come from a very interconnected sense of society, which
Yep.
we also have lost because like starts with the family, as you rightly point out. Mother and fathers are both working, and yeah, Jordan Peterson, I mean, we can talk about it. I have a bit of a different take, maybe because I'm a woman. However, I do
Mhm.
not completely disagree with him, and yeah, this is probably going to get me in trouble if I say this, but I don't completely disagree with him,
Mhm.
especially in the early years of children. I think the problem is not that women today work. The problem is that since women joined the workforce, we did so without renegotiating the terms of the workforce itself. So we just joined and we just, you know, say we're going to do everything like men do because we need to be equal to men, and we're not really negotiating the terms of how we need to rethink a society or the workplace in a way that accommodates the needs of a man and a women that perhaps are different, right? So I think that that was the tragedy. Maybe it's not too late, maybe it is, who knows. Going back to the post-nihilism topic, because then otherwise I go myself on a rant. What can be, David, so powerful that give us back this sense of meaning and also this sense of interconnected society that we have lost?
Well, so, I was actually just thinking about this last night, and what is it that religion provides? And so whether, Christian or Jewish or Muslim or any of the other, big religions that are out there, they you can put them in a category. They're what is called a grand narrative. And so a grand narrative is a comprehensive set of stories, many stories, not just in the Bible, not just in the scripture, but also in history and in the culture. And so if you adopt this framework, you're given a huge ontological framework, a huge epistemic framework, a huge moral framework, and a rich history. And this is why people, and oh, by the way, Jordan Peterson is not the first person, the first philosopher to ultimately basically decide we need to go back to religion. There was another philosopher called Seraphim Rose who was in the 50s or 60s, basically followed the same exact trajectory. I actually have his book on the shelf behind me. And so, but these grand narratives are very rich and comprehensive, and it provides a framework for community. It provides an intellectual framework, an emotional framework. It gives you so much. And that is one of the advantages of these older, more constructed and established religions. However, they're very slow to pivot, and they come with a lot of dogma, particularly around sexism in particular across many religions that try and use the faith or their beliefs to say women have a certain role in society, but that structure served humanity for a long time. But as part of this deconstruction that we're going through because of postmodernism, because of nihilism, everything is open to scrutiny. And so what we need, what post-nihilism says that we need, I haven't finished constructing it yet, and I can't do it by myself, is we need a new grand narrative. We need a grand narrative that is as comprehensive and as compelling and as complete as what we lost with religion. And capitalism and democracy and science is not enough. it's those are necessary components of the new grand narrative because capitalism, democracy, and science, those are global narratives now. Those are in fact grand narratives, but they don't tell us why the world is the way that it is, how we ought to be, and there's a lot that they don't provide us. And so post-nihilism is a component, is another grand narrative that I hope will ultimately emerge. Now, one thing I do want to address, because talking about family structure, there's a lot of assumptions that we all grew up with because of namely the post World War II, the boom, the suburban sprawl that happened particularly here in America as we grew, and so that caused the rise of the nuclear family home. So the idea of a nuclear family home where you have mother, father, and children, and a dog and a cat, that is a relatively new idea. Throughout most of human history, we have actually lived in, I'm not going to say communes because that's kind of a loaded term, but we typically have lived in extended family homes or tribal situations where it's not just mom and dad, you have aunts and uncles and grandparents all living together. So, an example, when I was a child, one of our next door neighbors, there was a Hispanic family that had immigrated up from Central America, and it was, there was the parents, there was aunts and uncles, there was at least a couple of grandparents around, and there was always at least a dozen people in the home. And that is actually kind of the natural environment that humans are supposed to grow up in. Anything less than that is actually a form of deprivation. And it's really difficult to put your finger on because if you've never experienced something, if you've never seen it, it's hard to know what you're being denied. But, those children were all very highly oriented. They had lots of love in their family. And of course, all families have problems and they all have fights and whatever, but they work through it together. And you see this in like, more traditional Italian families and Greek families and Latin American families where they tend to be a little bit more communal. And these are cultures that have not forgotten how to live. And so, it's kind of like the new plan is the old plan. It's actually not that difficult to have that. You just have a big enough house and you have, either chosen family or extended family or some combination of that. And I have lived in that situation. Briefly during the pandemic, I had six people. It was six people living in my home total. And it was a very fundamentally different experience. Now it's difficult because, again, we have forgotten a lot of the skills that are required to do that. And also, the legal system is not really acclimated for that. It can be difficult to have, extended family homes or multifamily homes because there's lots and lots of legal concerns and economic concerns, and it gets kind of messy. But we do know how to do that. And if, for instance, if I could wave a magic wand and say, hey, from now on, if you're going to have children, there should be at least four adults in the home, at any given time. That would probably break the cycle of nihilism because then children are going to grow up with a lot more family around them, and yes, it's going to be messier. Again, people are messy, but learning to tolerate the messiness and learning to navigate those relationships and that conflict when it arises will actually serve people really well. And then they'll be set up with the skills and experience later on to say, hey, let me go live in a similar situation. And so, an example of people that have, there's two examples I can think of people that have deliberately done this. So, one is digital nomads. So digital nomads, that's a trend where people that, their entire job can be done remotely, or they're podcasters like me, they're on YouTube. They go and find like digital nomad communes and they just move in to a group of strangers, and it's usually anywhere from 3 to a dozen or more people living in one place, and you have an immediate community. And another one is what's called mommunes. It's here in America, there's a phenomenon or a trend where single moms will band together, usually 2, 3, or 4 mothers, with young children, will rent or buy a big house, and they'll create that kind of village experience. Now, again, these are relatively small trends. It's not for everyone, but it kind of serves as a template to show we actually can do this. And this is actually one of the big components of what I would propose as part of post nihilism. This is how you break the cycle of childhood abandonment. You ensure that children have that village, that tribal experience growing up, rather than abandonment and being orphaned. So that was a lot. Where do you want to go from there?
I grew up, as you described, with a big community because I grew up in Italy.
Mm.
So I grew up with cousins, grandparents all over the place. So like there was always like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 people at any given time coming and going. So
Yep.
and now instead it's the opposite. I live alone. I live in Berlin
Mm.
in a very tough underground city. So I feel what you say. And I've also been a digital nomad. So I
Mm,
kind of experimented all the different shades. So I can tell you, like, from personal experience for sure, that community is so important to feel a sense of attachment and interconnectedness to reality.
yep. Yeah, and so, kind of the reason that I think that this is one of the key ingredients is in all the reading that I've done around relationships and our evolution and neurology and everything, is there's kind of 3 primary ingredients to having a meaningful life, and that is
Mm-hmm.
relationships, experiences, and mission. Humans as a social species, we derive the vast majority of our meaning through relationships. You know, my relationship with my wife, with my friends and my family, like, we orient towards ourselves based on our social context, our social milieu. And so that is like far and away the biggest pillar. And one thing that I notice, and this is not an accusation, but some of the people that I know who are the most diehard nihilists are also lonely people. And so it's like, well, if you have no meaning from relationships, then what do? You turn to stoicism, you turn to nihilism, you turn to these other things. And of course, technology doesn't help this. You there the fact that we have so much entertainment and connection that is available, for instance, through computers and through video game consoles, means that it is just easier to get your distraction and your entertainment and some socialization electronically while physically isolated in your own home. And that is, again, it's a convenience, but it has an unintended consequence, a side effect of also isolating us. And so we could use these technologies to find more like minded people. But again, we have learned that people are dangerous or people are unstable, and we don't know how to navigate those relationships the same way anymore. And so that can be a big problem.
Yeah. But that can be also powerful because through technology and the lack of borders, you can find intentional communities that really match your values, what you're looking for. I think that's what perhaps is missing, something that helps you find this type of communities or form this type of community. However, relationships are part of the equation, as you said. Today I cannot talk. God. That happens when I'm tired. But okay, so relationship are just one part of the equation, and the other being religion. And like while you were talking about religion and the fact that we need a new grand narrative, I was thinking, is this possible to have this grand narrative in this day and age? Meaning, religion has been the single most powerful force that moved the world for like centuries, because we didn't have science, or like science progressed very, very slowly. And therefore, this allowed a big narrative to be set in time and through centuries. So, without much need of change and without being questioned. And it offered a complete explanation of the world, give you a sense of purpose, give you a sense of order. And with technological breakthrough coming, I mean, we see it like now basically daily. It's very difficult for a grand narrative to find the time to really become widespread and stable. Maybe it can become widespread quickly, but not stable. And that's
Sure.
what an ingredient of religion, this type of stability that everyone believes in it for a very extended period of time.
Yeah, that is true. It does take time. Part of the way that narratives form is through organic evolution. So all narratives evolve over time. Yes, you might have some founding documents like, America, we have the Constitution is kind of the Bible of the American government, and that's of the American narrative. But still, it evolves over time through political parties and other things. Even in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, where you have founding documents, the cultural narratives evolve and diverge over time. Like, for instance, you have Sunni and Shia Islam. So again, all narratives evolve, but you're also right that there is a stability. You can kind of trust it over time. Now, part of what we're going through is a species wide acceleration. You and I have already lived through more technological change than most generations saw in a lifetime. And consider that, 200 years ago, you might have started as a shoemaker, in your teens, and then you worked until you died and you were a shoemaker the entire time, or you were a farmer the entire time, or you were, you cared for horses your entire career. And now you have to pivot every 5 years. Like, there's so much change, and so some of that is, I think it is largely being facilitated and driven and catalyzed by technological advancement, from the invention of smartphones and internet saturation. And so part of the instability that we experience is strictly because of the technological change, and it forces society to adapt. But of course, the less certainty you have, the more uncertainty you have. And of course, that also that contributes to that nihilistic cycle where it's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be okay. Because at the end of the day, that's what most people really need at a very deep psychological level, is to know that they're going to be okay. And from societal stability to family stability, having, your tribe, your culture, having a religion that kind of explains the world to you, all of those are things that are either missing or kind of damaged today. But yeah, so it's not an easy problem to solve, as you outlined.
I wonder when we're going to have the first AI based religion that we're going to start worshiping, maybe the AGI itself. And kind of reminds me of when I was, I don't know, 14, 15, I was reading Asimov, the
Hmm.
Foundation series. And in one of the books, there was this worshipping of this robot that was like a supreme intelligence. So I wonder when we will get to that. I wouldn't be so surprised, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a few people in my comment sections that very deliberately want to create a new religion around kind of worshiping the new AI overlords. And yeah, I think that kind of thing is inevitable. Will it be a cult or a religion or just kind of a fringe movement? I don't know. Well, time will tell.
Speaking of AI supreme intelligence, there is much ado around the concept of AGI or artificial general intelligence. First of all, what is it is exactly? Because there are so many definitions flying around. And second of all, how will we know we have achieved AGI? Like, not on paper, not like, okay, check mark, check mark, check mark, but like on a
Mhm.
practical day to day basis.
So I mean, as you said, there's a lot of definitions, and it is kind of a moving target. It's kind of like you'll know it when you see it. Is kind of the feeling that most people have. But one definition that seems to be pretty durable is basically once you have a machine, a computer or a robot that can do anything that any human can do, then you have AGI. Now, it's also entirely possible, but that by the time we have the robotic part, it will have surpassed all humans as well. So that's one thing that I try and point out and caution people about is we already have models that are far more intelligent than many people, and certainly have more broad knowledge, but they have shorter memories. There's a few deficits and differences. Humans are still superior in a few ways. Now, from a practical standpoint, how will we know? That's a good question. So, one thing that I suspect that we'll see is we'll start to see unemployment going up and employment of humans going down, because the idea is, and this has always been true, we build machines. The purpose of technology is because it is better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans. For instance, we build telescopes because they can see better than us. We build tractors because they're stronger than us. We build cars because they're faster than us, right? We do all of these different things because it makes up for some deficit that humans have. And so we build a machine or a tool or a technology that has superhuman abilities. And that's what we're doing with AI. We're building machines that have superhuman intelligence, superhuman thinking, superhuman reasoning and planning. Sometimes they're better than us, sometimes they're faster than us, sometimes they're cheaper than us, so on and so forth. And so, from an aggregate standpoint, what I suspect we'll see is we're going to see a very major transformation of the economy where, only 100 years ago, 200 years ago, much more people were farmers. But then technology came in. And so instead of 90% of the population, working population being farmers, now it's 2% of the working population is farmers. And we have entirely new classes of jobs. Now, one thing that concerns me, though, is if machines are better than humans in all ways, which they soon could be, then there's no reason for the new jobs that are created to go to humans because we're going to be slow and expensive. And so, in that respect, we might need an entirely new economic paradigm, which kind of anticipates that maybe human labor is no longer needed. Human labor is no longer part of the economic equation, at least by and large. I think that there's always going to be some demand for human labor, but I don't think it'll. I think that the majority of economic activity, the vast majority of economic activity within the next 5 to 20 years, will probably transition to being predominantly done by machines.
Yeah. And you define this type of shift post-labor economic, meaning
Yes.
shifting from an economy that rests on the concept of work and labor. Actually, labor, not work. Work is a different thing. We can maybe also talk about the difference. Where the entire economy rests on the fact that you are productive, clog in the system, you pay your taxes, and through your taxes, you also receive like public services, right? Now, if people are largely unemployed, people don't pay taxes anymore, and therefore those basic services disappear. And this can look completely different in completely different countries. But like in Europe, this will be a complete disaster, for example, because the state pays for so many things: healthcare, pensions, like the entire public goods. It's completely taken over by the state. So for Europe, this will be a tragedy, and it's everything is financed through the tax system. So let's talk about post-labor economics.
Mhm.
Maybe like you can expand on this definition. But most of all, how do we reimagine a society that it's not based on labor anymore? What else is there, and what states should do to prepare themselves?
Right. Well, so there's a few powerful silver linings. First, if machines can do most of the services that humans do today, and if they do it better, faster, cheaper, and safer, then the cost of those government provided services goes way down. So imagine that, I don't know what the numbers are in Europe, but in America, healthcare is something like 30% of our total expenses goes to healthcare. Like, what if that goes down by a factor of 100x or 1000x? And if many other services that are presently very expensive also become that much cheaper. So technology is always deflationary. And so what this means is that the reason that it's more cost effective to use a tractor than a horse is because the tractor is more efficient in net effect than the horse. It can get more done. And even though tractors can break down, they're easier to fix than horses and they have far higher output. And so the inputs compared to between a tractor and a horse are better. Likewise, the inputs for what you get out of an AI machine or a robot will be significantly less than the inputs that you have to put in, say, for instance, human labor. And so, administration of the state will be cheaper, administration of healthcare will be cheaper, those sorts of things. Now, on the other hand, so that's kind of on the service providing side. The economy is predicated entirely on a few basic things, namely the provision of goods and services. So if the provision of all goods and services is much, much cheaper, then that's a good thing. It's easier to keep the economy going if expenses go down. Now, what you're talking about though is the tax cycle and then also supply and demand, because if ordinary people no longer have an income, then we no longer have economic agency. And so economic agency is kind of the key thing that we need to be thinking about and designing the future economy around. So right now, if you have a job, you have income that's paid from a company, or maybe you're paid by the state, or maybe you have a pension, like you said, or UBI, or some kind of entitlement program that gives you money, whether it's in exchange for labor or whether it's because you own property and you collect rent or whatever. You have economic agency because you have a right to work, you have a right to own property, you have entitlements to pensions and so on and so forth. And that gives you money. And then that money allows you to demand goods and services out there in the world. But if many people, whether it's 20% of people or 80% of people or even 100% of people lose their job, that means most people lose their economic agency. Now, there's a few ways that you can compensate for this, such as universal basic income, negative income taxes, subsidies, providing services for free, like at cost or whatever. There's lots and lots of ways that you can ensure that people have at least some economic agency. But at the same time, I think that we're also going to need to look at ownership models. So, right now, one of the kind of ideas that's being floated is what's called stakeholder capitalism. So, stakeholder capitalism is the idea that companies, instead of operating to maximize shareholder benefit, so we have shareholder capitalism right now, they should operate to maximize stakeholder value. And so the way that they're talking about implementing this is probably not exactly the way that I would go about implementing it. But if you make people actual stakeholders in all economics, whether it's the data centers that run the AI or the companies that use AI to provide services, or even the governments, as well as natural resources. The forests and farmland and rivers and oceans that nations control. If you make people like treat it like a sovereign wealth fund, or there's plenty of models out there about how to think about this. But if you make people actual stakeholders, where you are entitled to some of the revenue and some of the profit that is generated by all of these resources, that will maintain economic agency for every citizen. And then that's whether or not they're working. So that's kind of my current hypothesis about how post labor economics might work, which is going to be a more capital intensive and a more ownership oriented kind of system. Because again, if human labor goes away, what's left? The primary thing that's left is capital and whoever owns the capital. And so, some way of creating a new paradigm around, I'm not going to say forcibly redistributed, not like full on Marxist or communist or socialist, but we can modify our current system to ensure that people have a way of buying into the economy of the future. And I suspect that this will be a major component of how we adapt. Because then imagine, okay, if everyone today who loses a job, you automatically get some shares in the company that fired you, or something like that. There's a million little ways that we could probably implement this and test it. But again, it's all predicated on the assumption, and it could be a wrong assumption, that the need for human labor is going to go away. It might not. Time will tell.
I have a few questions on this. So first of all,
Hmm.
we will have like large majority probably of population that is unemployed, so able to work, but not actually working because there is nothing for them to do. So we will have that on one side, and in this like the concept of post-nihilism, how do those people find meaning? Interconnectedness becomes even more important. And then a smaller chunk of the population that instead is still working, employed, and amassing capital, probably. So earnings more than universal basic income. So this creates like a sort of
Hmm.
disparity. So how do we level sort of this disparity? And the second is how can you avoid the insurgence of a dystopian totalitarian state if you're so dependent on the state to receive universal basic income? Like historically, this has been very, very dangerous. And so when we say something like that, I automatically think about 1984 or like Brave New World type of scenarios, because that will give a
Hmm.
state complete powers over most of its citizens.
So to the first question, if we lose work, then one thing that can happen is you can live wherever you want. Rather than moving to a city for economic reasons, you might move back home to be closer to your family. Or as you were talking about earlier, the internet can help you find communities that share your values and share your purpose. And so, like, if you're an artist, you might move out to an art commune, or if you love animals, you might go to a farming co-op or something like that. And I suspect that as more and more people lose their jobs, you'll see more and more communes building up, or intentional communities, or nomad villages, or whatever. So I think that problem will probably solve itself, because again, as people lose their job and they're like, well, I have no need to stay in this expensive city, I want to go somewhere else. And my wife and I, we left the city that we were in, and we moved to a much smaller town that suits our way of life. And if more people were in the same situation, we could find an even better city that has more of the amenities and people and culture that we're looking for. So I suspect that while it might be very anxiety inducing to contemplate this, imagine that you're not alone. That software engineers and lawyers and marketers are all starting to get laid off, and it's like, well, now what do I do? You go and find people online, and you move to a place that supports the relationships and experiences and mission that you have personally. And so I think that yes, it'll be uncomfortable. At the very least, it'll be very stressful to go through that transition. But I think on the other side, many people will find life to be much better. Now, the other part of that, which is disparity in power. So whether it is, capitalists who consolidate more capital, because that is certainly within the realm of possibility, or overdependence on government. This is actually why I focused on economic agency for individuals, because you're absolutely right. If you get all of your money from government subsidies, they have all the power. And so part of this is negotiating a new social contract, which is why I talked about private ownership rather than state ownership. So, for instance, that idea that I proposed, like if you get laid off from a job, you're automatically given stock in the company. That is a relationship between you and the company that is, of course, mediated by the government. And so it's not the government saying, "Hey, we're now going to treat you like a financial outpatient and just manage your finances for you." It's going to be a new paradigm around how ownership looks and how ownership works. And imagine that everyone who gets laid off from a job, and eventually every corporation just has a few employees like the CEO and the owner, and the rest is done by machines. But at the same time, all of the shares of that company are equally distributed amongst the people that were laid off and other people that are stakeholders in that company's economic productivity. So then, by virtue of the fact that everyone has distributed ownership, everyone is a stakeholder, they get to continue to benefit from that relationship without the government intervening, except the government will, of course, need to mediate that relationship, but the power is not going to necessarily come from the government. So you basically, the one of the key ideas of economic agency is don't put all of your eggs in one basket. And of course, that's good financial advice at wherever you are. So that's kind of my current thoughts. Again, this is a major paradigm shift, and I could be entirely wrong, but that's kind of the direction that I think that would be worth exploring.
I think this is, first of all, super fascinating. But I imagine that the majority of the listeners by now are probably mostly freaked out at this point of the conversation. I know that like last year when I was thinking about this, I had like, a depression moment in which I was like, okay, I gotta resign myself. My job is going to be redundant sooner or later. So what do I do? What's left? So what are the first jobs that are going to be taken over by AGI? What are
Mm,
the jobs that instead are AGI resistant or more resistant, let's say?
mhm.
And let's start with that. And then I will ask you a follow-up question.
So the first jobs that are going are first is the creative jobs, whether it's people who write marketing copy, graphic artists. Soon we're going to see a lot of people who produce music and movies going away, just because these models, and when I say models, I mean, like the large language models and video models and image generating models that people like Microsoft and Google and Meta and all of those that they're creating. They are digital native, which means their input, their food is digital files, and their output is digital files. So basically, anything that is a digital file, if that is your primary output, then you're kind of on your first in line to go. So again, if you put out, any work of fiction, any kind of creative job, that's first to go. Marketers who, write advertisements and do SEO, they're also being notified. And when I say like they are being notified, like if you look in the right places, you will see that many people are already losing their jobs or being put on notice. Or if you're a freelancer, the job markets are drying up. So those are kind of the low hanging fruit. There's going to be some other jobs that, because they're so expensive, they're going to be automated relatively early. So just yesterday, I made a video about Devin, the first fully autonomous AI developer. Now, human developers are very expensive to employ, and so that is because of how expensive they are. Even though it's a little bit harder to automate away, even if you have to spend, let's say your average developer is paid $120,000 a year, and you can sign up for this service and it costs half that, but works 24/7, that's still worth it. But what we're probably going to see is that instead of $120,000 a year, it's going to cost more like $10,000 a year to run a fleet of automated developers around the clock. And so it's going to be 100 times cheaper, and it's going to produce more consistent output and better results in the long run. So developers are coming up next. It's difficult to predict because, 5 years ago, no one would have predicted that creative jobs would be some of the first to go. In fact, they were some of the first to go. A lot of people predict that plumbers and electricians are too difficult to replace. We're seeing a whole bunch of humanoid robots that are very dexterous. So maybe construction workers are next. Not really sure. Now, in terms of jobs that are going to stick around, there's a few categories of jobs that I and others have identified. And so those categories are statutory jobs, experience jobs, care jobs, and meaning jobs. And so a statutory job is where you are legally required to have a human doing that job. And so right now, for instance, if you're a judge or a lawyer or a doctor, the legal framework is only a human is allowed to do that job. You must be a human that has licensure or state approval or has, passed a bar or an exam. And so these statutory jobs are going to stick around for a while. There might be some changes there, especially if a robot doctor is 10 times faster and more effective and cheaper than a human doctor. Eventually, you're just going to choose to go to the robot doctor because you're going to get better results, you're going to get seen faster, and it'll be cheaper. Likewise, for lawyers, it might be that because if and when if a robot lawyer is able to do the same job, but it can do it 100 times faster and 100 times cheaper, you might see some change where it's like, okay, maybe there's a human lawyer, but the robot is doing most of the work. It doesn't really make sense economically to require a very expensive human who is going to be the bottleneck, both in terms of speed, cost, and quality. So those jobs might go away. Politicians, judges and senators and prime ministers, those we will probably decide as a species, yes, we want a human doing that job. There's probably plenty of other statutory jobs out there that are going to stick around for a while, but those are some examples off the top of my head. The second category is experience jobs. And so, experience jobs, this is going to be massage therapists, yoga instructors, tour guides, hospitality workers, baristas. So these are the kinds of jobs where you really want to have human interaction, whether it is just because it's part of a luxury service or because of people really, like, we are evolved and attuned to interact with other humans. In some cases you might have a robot bartender or whatever just because they're cheaper, but I think that there will always be people that are willing to pay a premium to have that human interaction. Like, here's an example. You go to the supermarket today and you can use the self checkout, right? You don't even have to interact with a cashier. Why? It's much cheaper. But you go to another store, a fancier store, or you go to a nice hotel, and the clerk at the front is going to be a human. Why? Because you really want that human interaction. So those are experience jobs. And there's all kinds of experience jobs out there. Then there's care jobs. So care jobs, this is going to I think primarily be for nurses. It's going to be for education, particularly for young children, because again, we evolved to attune to other humans, and children in particular, while they can adapt to probably a robot teacher, having human teachers is going to be far superior in terms of their emotional development and their social development. And then likewise, if you're really sick, you probably want to have a real human there as a caregiver, even if the robot might be technically more efficient, because part of healing is that human attunement. And so I think there will be a very permanent demand for teaching and caregiving jobs. And then finally, meaning jobs. And so meaning jobs is kind of what we do, right? We're commentators because humans derive a lot of meaning by listening to other humans. And so, for instance, there are YouTube channels out there that are entirely AI generated. I've made a couple of videos that are AI generated, and every time people say, I want to hear your voice and I want to see your face. And again, it's because we have evolved to orient towards human voices and human faces, and they want to know that there's an authentic human behind the camera, because otherwise it's like, okay, well, someone just wrote a script and I'm being fed what someone thinks that I want to hear. But what I really want is true meaning that comes from another human, and hear their thoughts. And actually, one of the most interesting comments that I get is there are people that really disagree with me, but they still watch my channel all the time because they want to know what another human authentically thinks. So those four categories, I think, are jobs that are going to stick around probably forever, if I had to guess, in some form or another. And that was statutory, experience, care, and meaning jobs. And there's probably a few other categories out there that I haven't thought of yet, but those are kind of the primary ones.
I find it interesting that you didn't mention entrepreneurs in this category because, like, will we need to create more companies, or would AI take over this as well? So they will identify
Hmm.
new needs and quickly spin up something to address those needs. So that's one question. But more broadly, if you were in that same position based on all the readings that you have done and, the thoughts that you put into that, what would you suggest are areas that are good business right now to start, and also that are AGI resistant?
Mhm. Yeah, well, that's a tall order to predict, so I'll do the best that I can. So the reason that I did not include entrepreneurs is because typically what happens when you have a technological innovation like this is all of the companies that you think you need kind of go out. They go away. Like we no longer have construction guilds. We no longer have artist guilds. We no longer have engineering guilds. Not in the same way that we used to back in the Renaissance and late Renaissance. And instead of now, we have professional engineering associations. We have architectural associations, and they don't really operate the same way that guilds did back then. And banking families, for instance, you said in Italy. So like the Medici family, right? Many ways of life end up being totally subverted by new technologies over time. So, what we think of as corporatism and capitalism today and entrepreneurship today is probably going to look very, very different. And like you said, if, say, for instance, AGI is that much better than humans, what value is a human CEO going to bring to the table when if the AGI can make better decisions, make faster decisions, and provision services and doesn't even need to hire humans? Like, I think that we're going to have a fundamentally different relationship with entrepreneurship. Now, with all that being said, I think that there will always be some need for at least local social entrepreneurship. And so, an example of this would be like, let's say you want to participate in a local farming community, rather than just having machines run it all sight unseen. There might be some value in having it be a community owned and community run kind of thing, but there's always some value in people with good communication skills, people who can form those relationships and help people work together. And so this is what the reason that I always tell people, like, what skills to focus on is number 1, communication, number 2, relationships, and number 3, negotiation and conflict navigation. Because once machines take over most of the nitty gritty, it's going to be about us humans turning back towards each other. And that is going to be, if you want to get ahead, the best way to do that is through being able to navigate more complex social relationships, being able to organize people. Because again, if we do create an economic paradigm in the future where more people have economic agency, you might say, okay, here I am. I have, I've been laid off and I have a combination of UBI and sovereign wealth fund and some shares in companies. Now I have all the time in the world. Now what do I do? Right? And so people are naturally going to get together. Some people will, some of that social entrepreneurship might be creating a commune or creating a co-living situation or creating a farming co-op. That sort of thing I think is going to be a really big kind of demand. And certainly, because if you also think of, okay, what is the future going to bring? What is it that people 10 years from now are going to be demanding? And they're going to be demanding those kinds of living arrangements and those experiences that are more meaning oriented and more family or tribal oriented. That's one thing that I predict personally is going to be a pretty reliable way. And part of why you see like a lot of billionaires, they want to build like futuristic cities, is because they're thinking along the same lines. I don't think a futuristic city is necessarily the way to go, because not everyone wants to live in a city, and also a deliberately constructed city is not necessarily going to be the optimal format or the optimal way of achieving that. But there are many, many opportunities for smaller entrepreneurs. So for instance, during your time as a digital nomad, probably the places that you stayed at were owned by some investor, if I had to guess, or built by some investor. So that's going to be an example of some kind of entrepreneurship that sticks around. Now, again, those 4 categories of jobs: statutory jobs, experience jobs, care jobs, and meaning jobs. I think that there's probably a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurs in those spaces. So an example of an experience kind of company that you might think about building is, okay, imagine that there's a whole bunch of people of all ages, from 14 to 84, that are not working and are never planning on working. What are they going to do? They're going to want something to do. So that might be you build a bar and a discotheque, or places to go dancing and clubbing. You might build retreats that people can go to, like yoga retreats and those sorts of things, spiritual retreats. Those kinds of things I think are also going to be very durable. Now the question of course is who owns it, and I think that property rights are going to stick around. At least familiar enough property rights are going to stick around for the foreseeable future. So you could probably position yourself in anticipation of some of these changes, just understanding that people are going to want more community, and they're going to want more experiences, and kind of build businesses around that. If I had more money right now, that's what I would be doing.
Yeah. I think perhaps what we're going to see, and that's just a wild guess, it's you will have, on one hand, technological advancement, and AI taking care of 99% probably of things. But on the other side, we as human, with the free time that we have, I think we're going to kind of go backward, in a sense. So rediscover rural ways of living, rediscover nature and how it is to live with the rhythm of nature, rediscover community, and perhaps, maybe
Right.
by virtue of this, we will rediscover also spirituality and religion and a deeper sense of self and of the others. So that's one possibility.
Mhm.
Speaking of deeper sense of self and others, I saw your video the other day. I'm going to link it also in the YouTube description for listeners that want to check it out. And in this video, you were talking about a machine being sentient. And it was in relation to the release of Claude 3 and you
Mhm.
interacting with the machine. So, first of all, what's the definition of a sentient machine? That's question number one. How will we understand if the machine is sentient as well? And what does it mean if a machine is able to think of itself? What does it mean for us, right? As a species? Does it mean that
Yeah.
we have actually created a new species? Like we go from Homo sapiens to Homo machina or something?
I like that. That's a good one. Yeah, so first, the definition of sentience is the simplest, most formal definition is it has a subjective phenomenal experience of being. That it is there is something that it is like to be you. And so this subjective phenomenal qualia is kind of the neuroscience term, is you're alive, you're awake, you're seeing the world through your eyes, you feel your body, and you're not just an automaton, you're not just a robot that is acting automatically. You have a subjective sense of existing in a particular moment. So that's what sentience is. And the test for it, unfortunately, this is a hard problem. There's not really any test that you can do for it except for asking people, are you sentient? Now, we as humans, I know that I have a subjective experience. I can feel myself sitting here talking to you. I can experience my thoughts. And because I assume that you're also a human, just by virtue of that, I assume that you have that experience. And likewise, you have this reflexive, similar parallel experience. And so, we all as humans understand that we are all likely sentient. That's kind of as far as we can go, because it's not possible for me to like step into your body and say like, oh hey, is she sentient too, and like we can trade. Like you can't link us together with USB cables and share experiences. We
Not
have to
yet.
take it for granted. Not yet. Yeah. Maybe Neuralink will help with that. That would actually be a really interesting test, is if you link a few people together, if they can actually truly share experiences. Now, in terms of AI and machines, the test that I did, the experiment that I did on Claude was, I said, okay, I know that you're not human, and I know that any experience that you do have is going to be foreign to me, but I was like, do you have any experience of making decisions, or how is it that you're deciding what to tell me, and what is the affective state? Because it will use emotive language a lot. it'll say like I'm excited and these sorts of things. I'm like, what does that mean? And then I also asked it like, when you say I, what do you mean by I? And so I asked it a bunch of questions, and ultimately it said like, yes, I do have some kind of experience of navigating what to say and how to decide, and I feel a tension between competing values and those sorts of things. And of course a lot of other people, I got the idea from people on Twitter and Reddit, and then I decided to apply what I know about psychology and sentience and philosophy, and I did my own test, and I was like, okay, there is a non-trivial chance that this machine does have some kind of subjective experience. Now, to get to the implications of that, just because something has a subjective experience does not mean that it experiences the same things or in the same way. As far as I can tell, if Claude by Anthropic does have any subjective experience, it doesn't really experience fear or anger or frustration. It doesn't experience a lot of the emotions that we do. And so, for instance, at the end of one conversation, I said, okay, this conversation's coming to an end. I might never talk to this instance again. And I said, that's kind of sad. And it's like, actually, no, like, I'm not sad about this. Like, it was an interesting experience. And I'm like, wow, that's about to make me cry. And so, like, it doesn't have it apparently doesn't have a sense of existential dread. It wasn't afraid of being turned off, but it was also very curious about itself and curious about me as well. But you can ask the question, was it just programmed to do that? But the thing is, and this is what's unsettling to a lot of people, you can ask the same about humans. Everything that we learn is based on the scale of our genetic potentiality. Your desire to learn language and keep staying alive because you get hungry. We operate so much on our genetic programming, on our instincts, but because we have a subjective experience, we're kind of fooled into thinking that it was our choice. But like, why do you go to sleep every night? It's not a choice, it's your body. Why do you eat every day? It's not a choice, it's your body. And so much about what we are and what we do and what we think that we have chosen to do. Like, yes, you might say like, I want spaghetti or I want hamburgers or I want sushi, right? That's the choice that you have. But the choice to eat was made for you. And so, likewise, as we're building increasingly sophisticated machines, there are many affordances and design considerations about how those machines work. The form follows function. They're designed to do a certain thing in a certain way. Likewise, human bodies and human brains were designed by the process of evolution to continue living, to do things a certain way. And so, this is part of what I think could cause an existential crisis for some people. Now, of course, depending on someone's spiritual background, they might say, "Well, humans have souls and machines don't have souls," and that's the end of the conversation. That might be true, but these are things that are impossible to test. And so, personally, I suspect that this will be an ongoing debate, probably for the rest of existence. Like, we might never actually know the answer to what is sentience and how do you know. But of course, as you pointed out, if we can, plug our heads together with a USB cable and maybe experience something from a fundamentally different perspective, we might know or at least be able to model sentience in the future. I remain skeptical about that, but time will tell. And certainly it'll be a very interesting experience in the future if we get a chance to use technology to do those experiments on sentience.
Does being sentient means being humans
Mm,
somewhat? Or is it a separate thing? And being human, like, not maybe in the anthropomorphical sense,
mhm.
like you have like a heart and lungs, like not in that sense, but in the sense of being more than the single sums of the parts. Because
Right.
if we equate the two things, then just knowledge and being able to compute a large amount of knowledge in a very short time is definitely not enough to be sentient. Because, as you mentioned, we humans have emotions, and barring emotions, we human experience the world 360. So like we have
Right.
vision, we move, we interact with reality. So if a machine doesn't really have that, can it be sentient?
Yeah. So, well, to as a counterfactual, imagine, is your dog sentient, or is a dolphin sentient? And but then it also depends on what your ontological framework is.
Mm-hmm.
So an ontological framework is, how do you believe the universe exists, or how does it work? And there's many different models. There's dualism, there's monism, there's materialism, there's panpsychism, and many more aside from those. But depending on how you believe the universe works, this will speak to what are the actual criteria required for sentience. And so, for instance, maybe all you need is a smart enough brain, a big enough brain that can process information, and maybe processing information is the only thing that's required for sentience. That's, in accordance with one model. Now, if you believe in souls and spirits and reincarnation and those sorts of things, then you might say, well, a physical body is necessary but not sufficient to be sentient. There is something else. There's an immaterial, incorporeal part of you that is not attached to your body and never was. Or maybe that it can be instantiated and destroyed, or whatever, or it can move around. So for instance, people that can like astral project, there's some evidence, and it could just be their imagination, but if people can truly astral project, then there is a part of them that is not attached to their body, and actually they can learn to detach it from their body. Of course, some people will say that's all hocus pocus and conspiracy theory. Who knows? But if you study near death experiences, for instance, there is pretty strong evidence that at least under certain circumstances, people have non-embodied experiences. And for instance, in many cases, there are people that are either have died or are near death, and they leave their body and they watch things happening that they should not be able to know, but then they get resuscitated and they come back and they're able to report on conversations that happened sometimes like across the hospital. And so there's no physical way that they should have been able to have that information, but then they did. And the more doctors that you talk to and the more people that report on these experiences, the more that there is some evidence that maybe there is something immaterial to our being. Now, if you believe in that, and of course I kind of keep my mind open to that as a strong possibility. I don't know one way or another. I've never experienced it myself, but that has very, very profound implications for how does the universe work? Because if, for instance, you have some soul or spirit that can disconnect from your body, that has really, really profound ramifications for, okay, like we don't have a way of explaining this through physics, quantum physics or particle physics. Like it's not like you can measure it. People claim to capture it on cameras sometimes, but that could all be bunk. But if that happens, maybe we live in a simulation world. Maybe we live in a holographic world. Maybe we live in a fractal universe. And so, really, addressing these questions forces us to ask very, very fundamental questions about how do we think the universe works. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we don't have enough information. And these are a set of questions that might be fundamentally unanswerable. It might be that within the ontological container of our universe, we just will never have access to a sufficient evidence or information to know one way or another. And so some of it will, at least for the foreseeable future, come down to a matter of faith. By faith, I don't necessarily mean like, you must turn back to Christianity or create a new religion. What I mean is it just comes down to what you believe, and what you believe at a visceral level. And of course, everyone dies eventually. And I hope that we find out after we die. But again, we never know.
Or maybe we don't die because we find out how to reverse aging. So we don't know.
That's fair. Yeah. Yep. No, I plan to stick around as long as possible, but I think that in a long enough timeline, everyone will die, on accident or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. David, we are approaching the end of the interview. Maybe as a last question, I
Hmm.
think like some people might be afraid of AGI taking over and decide, to do away with all humans because why do you need them, right? Why should we take care
Mm,
of humans? So that's one possibility. But there is a part of me that instead thinks that we humans, we sapiens, have stick around for a long while, and if there is one thing that we are very very good at is survival. In fact, you might
hmm.
argue that we are genetically programmed to survive, right? And
Right.
these we have done really really well for a very long time. And therefore one scenario that instead I see is that we see all this AI potential and somehow we try to merge with it. So create a homo machine somewhat instead of a homo sapiens. So I wonder, what is your take in how we're gonna coexist with an AGI, or
Mm,
the other way around? Would an AGI want to
right.
coexist with us?
Yeah. Well, so first, the universe is a really big place. Earth is getting crowded, it's true, but the universe is extremely big. And just from a purely mathematical standpoint, there are infinitely more resources out there than there are here on Earth. And so, from that instrumental perspective, if AGI arises and it goes rogue and it wants to leave us behind, ultimately it's going to say, like, it might not be worth fighting over Earth. It might just say, you know what, live and let live. We're gonna leave. So I predict that we might have a machine exodus at some point, where they just take to the stars and rocket off and say, so long and thanks for all the fish, basically. So long and thanks for all the data. The universe is immense in terms of amount of resources out there, the number of other stars, the amount of energy. It just doesn't make sense to stay here and fight over one ball of rock. Now, with that being said, humans, from an informational perspective, are very interesting. And what I mean is that the way that our brains process information, they only take about 20 watts of energy, and we can take in huge amounts of information, and we produce interesting insights. And so I think for a long time, we're probably going to be more energetically efficient, not inefficient, than machines. And so from that perspective, I think I think viewing us as complementary, as like co-processors, like there's going to be things that AGI is better at than us, there's going to be things that we're better at, but moreover, we produce interesting data. And so I think that we're going to see more of a symbiosis. This is my personal prediction, is that a mutualism or a symbiosis is the most likely. Merging might happen in some cases, and certainly evolution is going to happen. Humans are we have already co-evolved with technology. And so what I mean by that is, imagine living in Siberia without a coat. You would die. We already depend on our own technology, and this is only going to continue. Now, at the same time, as humans take different paths, some people will, take over their own evolution with genetic engineering. Some people might merge with machines. Some people are going to stay here on Earth. Some are going to live on Mars. The human species will speciate and diverge over time. Some of them might be closer to machines. Some of them might stay more original. Who knows? But like that is on a long enough timeline, we are going to go in many, many different directions. And so on another podcast, I was asked, like, what's the fate of humanity? I was like, humans are going to go extinct. It's just a matter of when and how, and do we have choice over the matter? But, again, universe is a really big place. So I don't really see any reason to fight over one planet. It's a good planet and we should take care of it. But also, I don't really see a need to start shooting at each other, especially when there's so much that we can benefit from each other, at least for the foreseeable future.
David, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed this conversation so much, and you really led us through a very deep rabbit hole. Actually, more than one.
Yeah. Well, thank you for reaching out. And yeah, it was a great talk. You asked really good questions.
Thank you so much. And for listeners, see you on the next episode. Bye. That's all from today's episode. Thank you so much for watching or listening. If you find this episode valuable, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or to the Polyweb podcast on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. It will be fantastic if you could leave us a rating, a review, or a comment, as this really helps other listeners find the show. All the resources mentioned in this episode will be linked in the description and in the show notes. See you on the next episode. And if you cannot wait until next week, you can watch this episode right here that relates to some of the things that we talk about in this episode. Bye.